Music 311 Study Guide for Exam 1. Section 1, Rossini. Rossini lived from 1792 to 1868. He composed his first opera at age 13 and went on to write 38 more operas for a total of 39. He was most famous for his Italian operas and also composed opera seria and French operas. He had a premature career and stopped composing at age 40. His operas were named The Barber of Seville, and it was based on a play by Beaumarchais. It's an example of modern-day opera buffa. It has comic and absurd situations and lighthearted music. It was famous for its overture, which greatly showed off the orchestra's playing abilities, as opposed to other operas of the time, and demonstrated clear use of Rossini crescendo. Some Exam 1 work includes Rossini's aria, Act 1. It's usually sung by mezzo-sopranos today, but sometimes sung by sopranos. It features a clever, scheming female character, and its great vocal demands reflect the text. Rosina was usually played by a mezzo. Count Lindoro was played by a tenor. Figaro was played by a baritone, and Dr. Bartolo was played by a bass. Next up, on composers, we have Bellini. Bellini was born in southern Italy and lived from only 1801 to 1836. He only had time to compose 10 operas and moved to France when he became more well-known. Next is Giuseppe Verdi. He was an Italian composer with humble origins from a small town. He studied in Milan. He had a lifelong passion for Shakespeare, and it showed. He had 26 operas, and all of them were tragic except Opera 1 and Opera 26. He was influenced by bel canto. At his time, Italy was very ununified and ruled over by Austria. So a lot of his pieces reflected Italian nationalism, and he became somewhat famous for this. One of these pieces was called Nabucco. Verdi composed a piece called Rigoletto. It was based on a Victor Hugo play, The King of Muses Himself was the name of it. It contained elements of bel canto, but the elements were less obvious. It focused on the love between a father and a daughter. Act 3 includes a famous tenor aria, La Donde e Mobile, as well as a quartet. It had the characters the Duke of Montalla, a tenor, Gilda, a soprano, and Rigoletto, a baritone. Next up is Richard Wagner. Wagner was largely self-taught and had a strong interest in German literature, Norse mythology, and Beethoven. He composed 13 operas. He was an egomaniac and wanted to be in complete control of every aspect of his songs. He had several innovations. First of all, his operas were nationalistic but were more universal than personal. So they featured things like big themes such as good and evil, life and death, etc. He greatly expanded the size and scope of the orchestra. His advanced harmonics influenced 20th century music. His style evolved over his career, such as The Flying Dutchman, composed in 1843, and he developed the leitmotif idea, or leading motive, to reflect characters, symbols, etc. For an example of this, think about how Darth Vader always makes you think about the Imperial March song. Throughout his career, and while he was composing the Ring Cycle, he had financial support from King Ludwig II, also known as the Mad King, and he developed the Tristan chord, which is a half-diminished seventh chord, seen as having no resolution. Wagner and French opera. The Paris Opera is the opera house where Wagner's debut of his opera sucked, and the Grand Opera focused on things like important historical events. One of his operas, Meyerbeer, is an opera about the Protestant rebellion and the St. Barth's Massacre. Next composer is Georges Bizet, from 1838 to 1875. An exam work piece that he wrote was a piece called Carmen, and specifically Act 1, Sacchidea. It followed an ABA structure and was very seductive, and B minor was the main key. It was based off novella by Mérimée, and it was an example of exoticism and opera comique. So it featured gypsy instruments, Spanish dances, and used spoken dialogue over sung words. That symphonies were 4. He composed 4 symphonies, one in C minor, D major, F major, and E minor. He continued the standard that Beethoven established, and he worked very slowly. He was severely self-critical and delayed his first symphony until the 40s. Symphony number 1 in C minor, published in 1876, took over 20 years to make and followed the conventional sequence of movements. These 5 names for the Russian 5 composers: Rimsky-Koh, Borodin, Balakirev, Mussorgsky, and Cui. Next up, we have Brahms. Exam 1 music of his pieces includes Symphony number 4, which was composed from 1884 to 1885. Exam 1 work is going to be the final movement, Chaconne. This movement reflects his lifelong fascination with the Baroque era. It includes variations on a based ostinato and a harmonic pattern. It ends in a tonic minor instead of parallel major. Next, we have Franz Liszt, who lived from 1811 to 1886. He's one of the great virtuoso performers of the 19th century. He was born in Hungary, and his early studies were with Czerny and Salieri. He began concertizing at age 11, and he had many firsts. He was the first solo recital in a large hall, he was the first to perform from memory, and he was the first to give master classes. He focused largely on teaching and conducting, / supporting new music, mainly from Wagner, after 1847. This is called his post-virtuoso period. Next up, living from 1782 to 1840, we have Niccolò Paganini. He wrote the piece Caprice, which was a piece meant to give the appearance of being improvised. He did 13 poems, 2 symphonies, and hundreds of large and small piano pieces. Exam 1 material includes La Campanile, or The Little Bell, composed in 1848. Some notes about Liszt's orchestral endeavors. He wrote 12 symphonic poems, ranging from 1848 to 1858, and these were one-movement programmatic works. They featured one or a few themes, developed, repeated, and transformed. It contained traces of traditional structures and took themes from a variety of sources. Next composer we have is Tchaikovsky, living from 1840 to 1893. He was the most prominent 19th century Russian composer. He was born in a distant Russian province and moved to St. Petersburg. There he studied law and had a brief career in government. He studied at the St. Petersburg Conservatory and taught at the Moscow Conservatory. He had a successful career, but his personal life was in disarray. His cause of death was at 51 and is much debated, but some people think he committed suicide. He was secretly a homosexual, which led to some marriage drama. In fact, one of his marriages only lasted 9 weeks. He wrote 8 operas, 3 ballets, and 6 symphonies. Some of his most famous ballets include Swan Lake, The Nutcracker, and Sleeping Beauty, though he didn't like writing ballets very much. He had 6 symphonies: G minor, C major, D major, F minor, E minor, and B minor. He was noteworthy for his lyricism, his very large orchestra, and dramatic quality to his works. And most of them had autobiographical associations, especially 4 and 6, theorizers say. Some Exam 1 work includes Symphony No. 4 in F minor, Opus 36, 1878. All 4 movements had meaning behind them, as he admitted. Movement 1 featured fate, 2 featured feeling weary and alone, 3 featured a strong pizzicato section, and 4 conveyed forced joy and a return of fate from Movement 1. Next composer we have is Sergei Rachmaninoff, who lived from 1873 to 1943. He had a long career. He was a piano prodigy, and he almost quit after the first premiere of his first symphony was terrible. He had 3 symphonies, 4 piano concertos, and also composed many choral works and piano songs. At the Moscow Conservatory, he was a classmate of Seryabin. Exam 1 work includes Piano Concerto No. 2 in C minor. It was clearly influenced by Tchaikovsky and was very old-fashioned by 20th century standards. It had a long opening melody. Next, we move on to the Austrian composers, beginning with Gustav Mahler, 1860 to 1911. He married Alma Mahler and built a composing hut in rural Austria where not even his wife could interrupt him while he was writing music. He was fairly middle class and composed 9 symphonies, with the 10th being unfinished. He had great career successes, but personal tragedies in his life, much like Tchaikovsky. He had massive orchestras and very advanced harmonies. And he was also persecuted sometimes for being Jewish. His 8th symphony uses the largest orchestra possibly ever. His 2nd symphony, or the Resurrection Symphony, was written in 1895. And it was written when Mahler was wrestling with some philosophical things. It had 5 movements instead of the usual 4, and featured 10 horns, 8 to 10 trumpets, a harp, and an organ. Exam 1 work is the movement 5, the finale, and it was inspired by Beethoven 9. Next, we have Richard Strauss, living from 1864 to 1949. He was a horn player, composed his first piece at age 6, and he worked for the Nazis until they found out his daughter-in-law was Jewish. Whoops. He was inspired by Liszt and Berlioz and created a genre, an entirely new genre of music called tone poems. They were looser and more philosophical than older symphonic poems. Exam 1 work is Don Quixote, written in 1896. It was inspired by a 14th century Cervantes novel, fantastic variations on a theme of highly character. It essentially features a delusional knight that goes around thinking he's saving a bunch of people and vanquishing monsters when he's really just killing windmills and going after horrors for all his life. And then he dies sad and alone. Strauss's operas. There are 15 in total. His vocal music was crucial to his career, and he expanded greatly upon Wagner's work. Salome, written in 1905, was a piece based on controversial Oscar Wilde play. And his piece Electra, written from 1908 to 1909, was based on a Sophocles play with themes of revenge, hate, love, murder, etc. It was very violent and very intense.